Thank you for tuning in to the Orlando Museum of Art's virtual book club. I'm David Matteson, the Associate Curator of Education and Outreach and the facilitator of the book club that regularly meets at the museum. As part of this series, we are highlighting texts for lovers of art and literature. Today, I am joined by a very special guest. Christine Coulson is the author of Metropolitan Stories, a novel of connected vignettes that goes behind the scenes of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Christine spent 25 years working at the Met, and this knowledge informs her first novel. Christine, thank you so much for agreeing to this interview. I know this is a very strange time, but your novel has really presented me with a great deal of comfort during all of this, really reminding me of the importance of museums. And so I see I think you're at home, correct? Where are you joining us from? How are you adjusting to all of this?
Well, thank you, David. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
I'm joining you from outside of New York City, so I have to say that's a little hard for me to be away from my city. As for how I'm adjusting, it's a little bit like writing. You know, you can't look ahead too much. You know, you write one word at a time, one sentence at a time, one scene at a time. If you think about the whole thing, if you absorb the fact that you're writing a novel, it can be totally overwhelming. So I think I kind of approach this situation a little bit like that, day by day.
So are you writing right now? Have you been writing during this?
I'm not. I just, when I write, I really go into a hole, and I'm very, very disciplined and very ritualistic, and that's just not available to me right now. So it's in here.
How did this novel kind of come to be? I know you worked at the museum for 25 years. And so what kind of inspired you to start writing this particular short story collection?
Well, you know, people go to the Met once in a while. Some people only go to the Met once in a lifetime. But I got to live there for 25 years. And I wanted to capture what that was like. There's something about being in that building day after day, often alone, hearing your own footsteps on those marble floors, that allows you to relax in that big, intimidating place. And you start to see things differently, the art, the galleries, the people, and that's what I wanted to write about. Essentially about two collections, the art, which I give human characteristics, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, and the staff, who I really treat like exquisite works of art in their own right. It takes place in the first 10 years of my time there. So it's a completely analog world. I started in 1994, and it's very much a kind of pre-email culture led by the legendary director, Philippe de Montebello. As for how it came to be, you know, we mentioned process. Well, I thought about this book for 23 years before I wrote a single word of it. Most of my jobs at the Met were writing the Met story. I was a speechwriter, I was a ghostwriter, but it was always in someone else's voice, and sometimes in an institutional voice. And then in 2017, the museum gave me a sabbatical to write the novel. And it was the first time really that I was able to tell my story in my own voice. And that was pretty liberating. But I think I needed all that time before I sat down to write to kind of get it all in my head. I didn't take any notes. I never kept a journal. It was there. And these are often these stories are informed by things that are repeated in our culture over and over and over again. It's a very familial staff. And every day in that staff cafeteria is like Thanksgiving dinner, and we repeat the same tired old stories again and again and again. So it's not like I could have forgotten them.
Well, you really make the staff feel like a family through all of
Mhm.
this, right? Very connected. Some of them are a little more boisterous than others. I'm thinking of the curator that you write into the book, but a lot of them, it's just a beautiful kind of narrative. When we think about museums, and traditionally what the public might think of for behind the scenes would be maybe curators at the helm or fundraising professionals, but you really give kind of respect to a whole set of characters, including I loved the Lampers. I found that story incredibly funny about the group of individuals who light the museum. And then the rubber band man, who is the man who helps organize the shopping bags for the Met stores. And so, why was it important to you to pay respect to these individuals who might often get overlooked?
Yeah, I mean, I think that those are the unsung, unseen heroes of not just the Met, but of every museum. They're the people who really make it hum. Every museum has them. You know, at the Met, we have 2,200 employees, and 102 of them are curators. So that the rest of that staff is this little empire of people who do everything. I mean, the Met doesn't outsource anything. We have our own electricians, our own plumbers. You need something made of plexiglass, there's a plexiglass shop. And so there's a there's a kind of respect for that work that contributes to the whole, to that bigger mission that the Met represents. Those people are equally as devoted as any curator. And they shared that kind of familial spirit with us. And so, you know, I think of them now. In fact, the Met is closed like so many other museums, and the people who are inside that building taking care of that art, taking care of those galleries, are not the curators. They're the guys who keep the temperature steady, and the people who clean the floors, and the people who guard the art. You know,
Mm,
those are the people right now who are making sure our great treasure is protected.
wonderful. So thinking about a staff that size and a collection that size, I mean, so I work for obviously the Orlando Museum of Art is not the same scale of the Met. We're a mid-sized kind of regional art museum. And so I'm thinking, what are some of the challenges that you faced while you were there, while during your tenure at the Met?
The physical challenge of that space, you know, you're talking about a building that's 4 blocks long, 2 blocks deep, 2 million square feet. You know, part of the rite of passage of working at the Met is kind of getting physical ownership of those spaces. You know,
Mm,
a lot of my time in the early days of this book is navigating the physical museum. So a lot of when I was an assistant there, this again pre-email days, a big part of my job would be like hand delivering memos to people like across the building. And so you had to be able to do that efficiently. And there's all these spaces behind the gallery walls, this kind of upstairs, downstairs world where you would have to navigate. Sometimes you go out in public and then you slip behind these doors and you go up and down and across and over to get to where you need to be in an efficient way. And I think that the challenge of the physical space is the most significant one for any staff member. And once you've kind of conquered that, you're sort of in. And
mm.
that's a big one, though.
So you really bring magic to those tunnels, though. I mean, there are several stories that take us and transport us into these places that the public would never have the opportunity to really see at the Met.
Right, the
Um,
tunnels are actually below the basement of the museum. So there's the basement, which is a kind of hive of activity where all kinds of things are going on. But then below there are these old tunnels, which were the kind of water tunnels from the reservoir behind the New York Public Library at 42nd Street and Fifth Avenue was a reservoir. And so these old aqueduct tunnels were kind of connecting 42nd Street all the way to Uptown. And now they're long been closed. That's now Bryant Park. But we use the tunnels for storage. And in the old days, we would have to go down to the tunnels, which are super creepy. And no one's in the tunnels. So you would have to go down to the tunnels to retrieve some memo or something, or to store some things. And the atmosphere down there was just fascinating. And in fact, when I wrote that story about the tunnels, I hadn't been down there for about 10 years. So I had someone take me down there to kind of try and find the story I wanted to tell. And, boy, did it appear.
Oh, truly. So in
Yeah.
addition to the magic of the spaces and the staff, the people, but also the objects, do you have any favorite objects at the Met that we might not pay much mind?
Well, I think, of course, that this book is populated with my favorite objects. And we certainly have the chair that's in chapter 2, is an old friend. For those who haven't read the book, the second story is written from the perspective of an 18th century chair in the Met's French period rooms. And it's by no means the focus of that gallery, which is filled with glistening chandeliers and gilded surfaces. Marie Antoinette's dog bed is in there. This chair is off to the side, but it's particularly intriguing to me because it has its original upholstery, which is a pretty rare thing. And I imagine the 18th century dust that's still in that seat, the 18th century dandruff that's probably still clinging to that ancient silk. And that kind of collapse of time is really important to me. I think objects like that have memory. I think they're witnesses to history. And I like to consider what they've seen. And I suspect that chair has seen a lot.
Oh, I would agree. There are several paintings in our own collection that I walk by and just imagine, what has this work seen? What has this work really endured to end up here through? And we don't have anything.
I mean, this is a book about the Met, but I think it's about the world of the imagination. The way that I look at the Met's collection could be applied to any museum anywhere. And so I think that more expansive idea of thinking about these objects from their perspective and thinking about them less as these perfect examples of something in a museum, beautifully lit and almost sterilized in a way. I think it's nice to think about what they've seen, where they've been, what they've traveled to get to that point.
And what they've endured. I'm thinking about Adam in this case, the sculpture that you write about, and that actually happened. This kind of
It did. One of the great tragedies during my time at the Met was in 2002 when an early Renaissance statue, a marble statue of Adam, fell from its pedestal and broke into thousands of pieces. It is, it's the greatest tragedy that can happen in our museum, the loss of a work of art. And that, I remember that morning so well. And, that space was treated like a crime scene. They put a grid on the floor and they put the contents of each square in a little bag. And over the next 11 years, brilliant, devoted conservators rebuilt Adam. And he became famous for it. He was very unheralded before he fell. And, there was a part of me when that happened, and maybe this speaks to the way my imagination works, but on that morning when that happened, there was just this one moment where I thought, I wonder what it felt like for that sculpture to be in the air. Not when it hit the ground, but that moment of kind of release when it was like, whee, something that is not supposed to move by definition. Suddenly, maybe it was exciting. So one of the first things I wrote in writing this book were the couple of paragraphs describing that sculpture in the air. That's the great thing about writing fiction, is you get to figure out how does Adam get in the air, and now I get to write the characters around Adam that create that moment, and that for me was a great joy to write.
Hmm. I mean, it's one of my favorite stories in the book. And then another one of my favorite stories, and really the only visitor that we get to meet, is Melvin.
Melvin,
Talk, can you
yeah.
talk about Melvin?
Melvin. So many people love and feel for Melvin. And you're right, Melvin is the only member of the public in the book. For those who haven't read it yet, um, Melvin is a guy who has recently lost his job. And he's embarrassed by that, and still feels the need to leave his apartment and pretend he's still employed. So instead of going to his office, he goes to the Met, and he sits on the steps of the museum, and watches one of the Met's custodians clean every day. That story started because I wanted to write about those steps as kind of a great iconic New York site. Um, they're so infamous, and the entire novel takes place within the physical building except for that moment on the steps. And I wanted to kind of write from the perspective of the steps about all that you see in New York going by. And Melvin was sort of the way to do that. He kind of came into my head, as characters do. Um, and in the end, the story became that Melvin eventually goes inside, and without giving anything away, it turns out that Melvin is actually kind of one of us.
Hmm. He's a wonderful character. And the Rubber Band Man. I think those two characters were the ones that we spent for our book club discussion at the museum. We
Hmm.
spent a great deal of time talking about Melvin and the Rubber Band Man. So they're sort of memorable characters coming out of this collection of stories. There's also a story, it's at the end of the Mez Girls, the chapter about the development officers who kind of help run many of your events. But there's a woman at the end of that, a wife who is a widow, and there's just sort of this.
Mrs. Havering.
Yeah, she is
Frank, Mrs.
sharp.
Havering.
So she is sharp. I mean, so you don't get to see a lot from the public side of things, but we do get to see a lot of these kind of characters that help fund the museum as well. And she is one of them.
Well, I think it was nice to write about her she shows up a bunch of times in the museum, and she becomes the sort of archetypal donor. And wherever I needed a donor, it became her. And I liked I worked very hard on the structure of this book to keep paring it back and pruning it, but also to understand the rhythm of when characters would reappear, so that connective tissue makes sense. One of the reasons it's a novel and not a collection of short stories is because you have to read it in order, because people like that get revealed to you and then they show up again later, and the stories allow you to aggregate knowledge along the way. So you can't really jump to the chapter 11 and understand it without having read the previous 10 chapters. And she's one of those characters who was just always a perfect solution if I got stuck, because she's so fun to write.
Yeah, she is. She
She's a
is
little
fun.
cranky, but she's really her heart's in the right place, and yeah, and she has a good backstory. So
What were you reading any books? I know we've talked about process, but I'm always interested when I talk to authors of what they were kind of reading or influenced by, or other authors that kind of speak to them, because it is a beautiful novel of magical realism. And so I'm wondering if you have any other kind of inspirations or influences that have affected your writing.
Oh, plenty. I don't ever, I never read while I'm writing because that
Hmm.
gets too messy and probably too influential. Um, but I'm a big kind of John Cheever and Fitzgerald and Graham Greene. Those are my guys that I always go back to. Um, and you know, the magical realism part, to me, and I have mixed feelings about that term. It certainly applies to what I'm doing, but in some ways I kind of feel like the parts that are where I apply the magic, where I use that, those leaps of imagination, for me are almost the most real, because that's the only way I could explain how I feel about those objects, how I think about um, the way that they function within the museum. I had to give them those characteristics and those qualities in order to animate them in the way that I feel they are sort of active within our lives within the museum. So it was less a literary device than it was kind of a necessary necessary element to deploy to deliver what I was trying to capture.
Hmm. Well, it really spoke to, I think this was one of the highlights of our season this year for the book club, and we've been doing this for about 4 years now. And it's just kind of a love story to the Met, but also to all museums, like what you've already shared. This is very much so applicable. And if I can share, one of the activities we did after we read this book was everyone and the group went into the museum and found an object that really spoke to them. And they had to
Oh, I
write kind
love
of a
that.
poem. They had
Nice.
to write a poem in response, like an ekphrastic activity. And so it was just beautiful. It was a nice way to guide kind of a tour afterwards, because we all got to see what was influencing and exciting everyone in the group, which everyone has their own kind of response to the objects in the museum.
Right, and I think that's the works of art in this book are probably on nobody's masterpiece list. These are the objects that speak to me. And I
Mm.
think what you did is really important, which is I often recommend that people should feel empowered to find their own favorites in the Met or any museum, not just what someone else deems important, but just go in and wander and see what stops you in your tracks, and then spend some time with it. 15 minutes, which is an eternity in front of a work of art. The average visitor spends about 6 seconds looking at something. So if you spend 15 minutes and really look at it, look at the details, look at the edges, sort of ask yourself why the artists made the choices that they did. And then I think the most important thing to do, because that 15 minutes will reveal a lot, and then just leave. Just stop trying to conquer the museum and just walk away. And that object will stay with you for days, months, and you'll never look at it the same way again, because now you have a different relationship with it. And I think that's what, working in a museum allows you. You have that time in the museum by yourself, and the ability to slow down and do that kind of just quiet looking that's completely personal. It's not about what's on the label, but it's about that work of art operating on some level with you personally. And I think that's incredibly powerful. And
I
I
do
think
too.
about those objects more than anything. And the people who you had write poems about those objects, they should think about those objects now that they don't have access to them. And
Mm.
they've got so much more memory about them and a different kind of kind of connective tissue with those works of art that they can call upon now when they're not available.
True, very true. I love this piece of advice. Go for the visceral reaction. I think it's interesting to say to walk away after you find that piece, though, right? Because you're so right. We do go in and we try to conquer museums. I can't tell you how many museums I've been to where I just click through, take as many photos as I can on my phone,
Yeah,
and I don't
yeah.
really see anything at the end of
Right.
that. So, this is a very difficult time for museums as well. We've seen the headlines about the loss of revenue for some of these larger institutions like the Met. We've also seen headlines about smaller institutions that might not reopen after all of this passes. Do you have any words of wisdom for those visitors or the public that might be listening to this interview about museums and maybe supporting them?
I think museums are our collective memory. They can teach us an extraordinary amount about survival and the power of objects to tell our story. Um, I wasn't planning to read, but I think I might, if you don't mind,
No,
because
please. Yeah.
I always read a passage at the end of my talks. And since you asked this particular question, I'm gonna read these kind of brief paragraphs. So in the
Please.
beginning of the book, you'll remember there was a chapter called We, which was defining who we are as the staff of the museum and how we feel about those objects. And my editor challenged me to write a kind of refrain to that by talking from the point of view of the works of art and how they feel about us, the staff. And that chapter called Object Lesson is where this is from. And I think it's really relevant for this moment that we're experiencing right now. Survival is a funny business too, a losing game, literally. They love us and we lose them all. The ones who made us, the ones who gave us, the ones who sat down and played with us, the ones who held us or just laid eyes on us, the ones who bought, traded, and sold us, cleaned us, redeemed us, brought back the sheen on us, loved us, learned everything there is to know about us. Imagine how many reflections that ancient mirror has seen. Now imagine every one of them, dead, gone. But we live on. We are the proof, sticky but silent, hanging on that wall, standing on that pedestal, the proof that anyone was ever there at all.
Beautiful and haunting
I think
too.
that's why we need museums, and I don't think it's negotiable.
Neither do I. So thank you for reinforcing that. And thank you so much for agreeing to this interview.
Oh,
We
my
are
great pleasure.
this book was a huge hit with our museum's book club, and I encourage people to join us for our next discussion. But as well as go out and purchase your copy of Christine's debut novel, Metropolitan Stories, and to do so, consider visiting Writer's Block Bookstore's online shop for fast and convenient shipping to your home. And it's fulfilled by a local independent retailer here in Winter Park, Florida. I hope you have enjoyed this virtual book club discussion. To show your financial support for the museum, again, museums are non-negotiable. Text OMA to 71777. Donations made before April 30th are eligible for a 15% match through the United Arts of Central Florida collaborative campaign. Thank you for watching. Be sure to get your copy of the book and follow the museum's social media accounts for more inspiration. Thank you, Christine.
Thank you. Be well, everyone.
Yeah, stay safe.